The bustling streets of Chicago pulsed with life as Cassandra Cassie Blake made her way home, her footsteps soft against the backdrop of distant traffic and muffled conversations. The early December chill bit at her cheeks, and she pulled her scarf tighter, seeking warmth as she reached her small but cozy apartment on the edge of Lakeview. It was a sanctuary of sorts, a reflection of her personality with warm tones, scattered art prints, and a cluttered but charming desk where her laptop sat glowing faintly, awaiting her return. Cassie was a woman of quiet intensity. At 28 she had built a comfortable life as a graphic designer, her talent recognized by clients across the city. Yet beneath her composed exterior lay a fire she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge. That fire had a name: Emily Parker. Emily, with her effervescent energy and radiant smile, was a force of nature. A rising star in Chicago's culinary scene, she had a knack for commanding attention without trying, her confidence infectious. They had met a decade earlier in a college art history class, Emily's bold opinions clashing hilariously with Cassie's quieter, more measured observations. What began as friendly banter turned into late-night study sessions, impromptu road trips, and a friendship that weathered the storms of young adulthood. But for Cassie it had always been more. The knock at her door startled Cassie from her thoughts. She set her keys on the counter and smoothed her sweater before opening it to reveal Emily, bundled in a long coat, cheeks flushed from the cold. The scent of her familiar perfume, a blend of vanilla and citrus, wafted in, instantly warming the room. "Hey, stranger." Emily grinned, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation as she always did. "You won't believe the day I had." Cassie smiled, closing the door behind her. "Come in, make yourself at home." "As if you need an invitation." Emily laughed, shrugging off her coat and tossing it onto the nearest chair. She looked around, her sharp blue eyes scanning the room like she always did, as if cataloging every change in her best friend's life. It was a habit that made Cassie feel both seen and exposed. The evening unfolded with an easy rhythm, their conversation flowing effortlessly over shared takeout and a bottle of wine. Emily regaled Cassie with stories from the kitchen, disasters averted, eccentric customers, and a sous chef who apparently had a vendetta against Rosemary. Her laughter lit up the room and Cassie found herself leaning in, captivated as always. But something was different tonight. As Emily reached for her glass, her fingers brushing against Cassie's on the table, the touch lingered just a fraction too long. Cassie felt her pulse quicken, the warmth of Emily's skin sending a spark through her. She pulled her hand back, trying to mask the reaction. "Everything okay?" Emily asked, tilting her head. "Yeah, of course," Cassie replied quickly, forcing a smile. But her voice betrayed her. Emily studied her for a moment, her gaze searching, and Cassie felt the weight of it, like a spotlight on a secret she'd hidden for years. Later, as Emily helped clear the table, Cassie couldn't shake the feeling that she was teetering on the edge of something. She watched as Emily moved through her kitchen with ease, humming softly to herself. The sight was achingly familiar, yet tonight it felt charged, like every movement, every glance, carried an unspoken question. "Hey, remember that time we tried to bake cookies in your dorm oven and nearly set the place on fire?" Emily asked, laughing as she rinsed a plate. Cassie chuckled, grateful for the distraction. "You mean the time you decided we didn't need to measure anything?" "Yeah, hard to forget." Emily grinned, leaning against the counter. "Come on, admit it. It was fun." "It was a disaster," Cassie replied, but she was smiling. For a moment neither of them spoke. The silence was comfortable yet charged. Emily's eyes lingered on Cassie and Cassie felt her heart race. She turned away, pretending to straighten a stack of napkins, but the weight of Emily's gaze was inescapable. That night, after Emily left, Cassie stood by the window watching the snow begin to fall. The city lights blurred against the frost-covered glass, and she pressed her forehead against the cold surface, her mind racing. She had been so careful all these years, locking away her feelings, convincing herself that the friendship they shared was enough. But tonight had shaken her resolve. She could still feel the echo of Emily's touch, the way her smile had seemed softer, her glances longer. Was it all in her head? Was she seeing something that wasn't there, or had Emily felt it too? Cassie sighed, closing her eyes. The answer didn't matter, she told herself. Emily was her best friend and that bond was too precious to risk. But as she crawled into bed, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't escape the truth. She was hopelessly, irrevocably in love with her. and it was getting harder to pretend otherwise. The December air was sharp, a crisp reminder of winter's grip, as Cassie adjusted the place settings on her small wooden dining table. She had gone through 3 different arrangements, each subtly adjusted, though Emily likely wouldn't notice. Cassie laughed softly at herself. What was she so nervous about? This wasn't the first time Emily was coming over for dinner. They had shared countless meals, countless evenings. But tonight felt different. The sound of a knock at the door jolted her from her thoughts. Her stomach flipped, and she took a moment to smooth her sweater and check her reflection in the hallway mirror. Casual but not careless, she looked fine. Still, her hands trembled slightly as she opened the door. Emily stood there, bundled in a coat that looked both oversized and effortlessly chic, her cheeks rosy from the cold. She was holding a bottle of wine, her face lighting up when she saw Cassie. "Hey. God, it's freezing out there," Emily said, stepping inside and shaking off the chill. "I brought something to keep us warm." She held up the wine, her grin disarming as always. "Perfect," Cassie replied, her voice steady though her pulse wasn't. "I just finished setting everything up." Emily slipped off her coat, revealing a soft cream sweater that hugged her figure just enough to make Cassie's chest tighten. She smelled like winter, crisp air and that intoxicating vanilla citrus perfume she always wore. It lingered in the air as Emily moved toward the table, her presence filling the room in an instant. "This looks amazing," Emily said, eyeing the spread Cassie had laid out. "You've seriously outdone yourself." "It's just pasta," Cassie said, brushing off the compliment even as a blush crept up her neck. "Nothing fancy." "Don't be modest. You know I love your cooking," Emily replied, sliding into one of the chairs. "Honestly, after the day I had, this is exactly what I needed." Cassie poured the wine as Emily recounted her latest kitchen adventures. Stories filled with fire alarms, temperamental sous chefs, and a last-minute save that had her restaurant's patrons applauding. Emily's voice was animated, her hands moving as she described each chaotic detail, and Cassie found herself mesmerized. She always had been, really. Emily had a way of commanding attention, of making the mundane feel electric. But tonight it was more than just admiration. Cassie's gaze lingered too long on Emily's hands as they gestured, noting the delicate lines of her fingers, the way they curled around the stem of her wine glass. When Emily laughed, the sound was warm and full, wrapping around Cassie like a blanket. It was a laugh she knew well, but tonight it seemed to reverberate deeper, stirring something in her that she had spent years trying to suppress. As the evening wore on, Cassie found herself fighting a losing battle with her emotions. Emily's proximity was unbearable in its sweetness. The way she leaned closer to emphasize a point, the way her smile seemed to linger just for her. Every moment felt charged, every casual touch electric. And when Emily reached across the table to playfully tap her hand during a joke, the warmth of her skin against Cassie's ignited a storm inside her. "You okay?" Emily asked, her brow furrowing slightly. "You've been quiet tonight." Cassie hesitated, her heart pounding. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired, I guess." Emily tilted her head, studying her with those sharp blue eyes that always seemed to see too much. Cassie quickly busied herself with clearing the plates, escaping to the kitchen under the guise of washing dishes. She needed a moment to breathe, to steady herself. As the water ran over her hands, she clenched her jaw, berating herself. This was Emily, her best friend. The one person who had been her constant, her anchor. She couldn't risk ruining that, no matter how strong the pull was tonight. But the feelings that had been buried for years were clawing their way to the surface, relentless and undeniable. "Need help?" Emily's voice came from behind her, startling her. Cassie turned to find Emily leaning against the doorway, her arms crossed and a soft smile on her lips. "No, I've got it," Cassie replied quickly, her voice tighter than she intended. "Cass." Emily's tone was gentle and she stepped closer, placing a hand on Cassie's shoulder. The touch was light, almost absent-minded, but it sent a jolt through Cassie, who froze under the weight of it. Cassie's breath caught, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of them. She could feel the warmth of Emily's hand through her sweater, the faint scent of her perfume filling the space between them. She wanted to turn to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she gripped the edge of the sink, her knuckles white as the storm inside her raged. "You're acting weird tonight," Emily said, her tone teasing but with an edge of concern. "Are you sure you're okay?" "I'm fine," Cassie replied too quickly. She forced a laugh, turning to face Emily, who was now closer than she had realized. Their eyes met, and for a split second, Cassie thought she saw something in Emily's expression. A flicker of something that mirrored the chaos she felt. But it was gone as quickly as it came. Emily stepped back, breaking the moment with a light laugh. "Alright if you say so. But you know you can talk to me, right? About anything." Cassie nodded, her throat tight. "Yeah, I know." When Emily left later that night, Cassie stood at the door, watching her disappear into the cold. She closed it softly, leaning against it as the weight of her emotions crashed down. Her heart ached with the force of everything she had kept hidden, everything she could never say. She sank onto the couch, running a hand through her hair as her mind replayed every moment of the evening. The way Emily had looked at her, the way her touch had lingered. Was it real, or was it just her heart betraying her, seeing what it wanted to see? Cassie buried her face in her hands. She had always known this love was impossible, a dream she couldn't afford to chase. But tonight that dream felt closer than ever, close enough to hurt. The days that followed Emily's visit seemed to blur into a haze for Cassie. She went about her routine, work, errands, and the occasional half-hearted attempt at socializing, but her mind refused to let go of the moments they'd shared that night. Every detail replayed itself on an endless loop. Emily's laughter, the fleeting touch of her hand, the way her gaze had lingered just a little too long. Cassie couldn't help but analyze it, her thoughts spiraling into dangerous territory. Was she imagining things? Was it possible that Emily felt something too, something more? She had learned long ago to bury her feelings. But now, with Emily's recent visit stirring the waters, the surface tension was breaking. Every interaction felt loaded with possibilities, and Cassie found herself watching for signs, hoping for something to confirm what she dared not say aloud. It was a week later, on a gray and misty afternoon, when Cassie found herself back in Emily's orbit. They had planned to meet at a cafe downtown, a trendy spot Emily loved for its artisanal pastries and cozy atmosphere. Cassie arrived early, nerves buzzing under her skin. She chose a corner table by the window, her view of the street partially obscured by fogged glass. The scent of fresh coffee and warm bread filled the air, but she could hardly focus on anything beyond the anticipation of seeing Emily. When Emily arrived, the room seemed to shift. She walked in with her usual confidence, her caramel-colored coat draped over one arm, a beanie perched slightly askew on her head. Her smile, as always, was disarming, and Cassie felt the familiar tug in her chest. "Sorry I'm late," Emily said, sliding into the seat across from her. "Traffic was insane." "You're not late," Cassie replied, her voice softer than she intended. She couldn't help but notice the way Emily's cheeks were flushed from the cold, the way her hair framed her face just so. Emily brushed a strand of hair behind her ear and grinned. "You're too nice. If the roles were reversed, I'd have given you so much grief." Cassie laughed, trying to keep the moment light, but the warmth of Emily's gaze lingered, leaving her breathless. The conversation flowed as it always did, easy, familiar, full of shared jokes and stories. But underneath the surface, Cassie began to notice subtle changes. Emily's smile seemed softer, her eyes holding Cassie's a fraction longer than necessary. There was a moment when Emily reached across the table to steal a bite of Cassie's scone, her fingers brushing against Cassie's in the process. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a jolt through Cassie, her cheeks flushing despite herself. "Sorry," Emily said, laughing as she pulled the plate closer. "But you always pick the best food." "It's fine," Cassie replied, though her heart was pounding. The interaction had been innocent, perfectly normal between friends, but it felt like so much more. Or maybe she was just imagining things, projecting her hopes onto gestures that meant nothing. Later, as they walked through the damp streets, Cassie couldn't shake the feeling that there was a shift between them. Emily's energy seemed quieter, more introspective. They strolled side by side, their conversation dipping into comfortable silences that felt almost intimate. At one point, Emily nudged Cassie with her elbow, a playful gesture that drew a shy smile from both of them. "Do you ever think about how long we've been friends?" Emily asked suddenly, her voice soft. Cassie glanced at her, startled by the question. "Of course. Why?" Emily shrugged, her hands shoved into her coat pockets. "I don't know. I guess I was just thinking about how rare it is, you know? To have someone who's always there no matter what." Cassie's chest tightened at the words, a bittersweet ache blooming within her. "You've always been there for me too." Emily smiled, her gaze warm and lingering. I guess we're lucky. For a moment, Cassie thought she saw something flicker in Emily's expression. Something vulnerable, something unspoken. But the moment passed and Emily looked away, her breath visible in the cold air. Over the next few weeks, the dynamic between them grew increasingly complex. Cassie became hyper-aware of every interaction, her heart betraying her at every turn. Emily's touches, though casual, seemed to carry an extra weight. When they hugged goodbye, Emily's arms lingered a moment longer than usual, her breath warm against Cassie's ear. When they laughed together, Emily's eyes sparkled with a softness that left Cassie wondering if she was imagining things. One evening they were at Cassie's apartment again, sharing a bottle of wine and watching a movie. Emily had curled up on the couch beside her, their legs brushing in the limited space. Cassie tried to focus on the screen, but her attention kept drifting to Emily. Her laugh, the way her fingers played absent-mindedly with the hem of her sweater, the subtle rise and fall of her breathing. At one point, Emily turned to her, their faces inches apart. You're not even watching, are you? She teased, her voice low and playful. Cassie's stomach flipped. What? Oh, I just... Emily grinned, cutting her off. Liar. Her gaze softened, and for a moment the air between them felt heavy, charged with something Cassie couldn't name. Cassie's breath caught, her heart racing as Emily's eyes lingered on hers. She swore she could see it now, an echo of her own longing reflected back at her. But just as quickly, Emily looked away, breaking the spell. Alone that night after Emily left, Cassie sat on her couch, her mind spinning. The line between friendship and something more was blurring, and she couldn't tell if it was real or if her own feelings were clouding her judgment. She wanted to believe that Emily's glances, her touches, her lingering smiles meant something. But doubt crept in, whispering that it was all in her head. Cassie closed her eyes, leaning back against the cushions. The weight of her unspoken feelings was suffocating, but the hope, the fragile, impossible hope, was worse. If Emily truly saw her, truly felt the same, what then? Could they risk everything they had built for something so uncertain? The evening began like so many others. Cassie had prepared a simple dinner, the kind of meal Emily always teased her about for being too humble for someone so talented. The atmosphere was warm and familiar, the apartment lit softly by the glow of string lights and candles. Emily arrived with her usual flair, breezing in with a smile that seemed to fill the space. She carried a bakery box in one hand, promising that dessert would outshine the dinner, no offense. Cassie laughed, taking the box from her. None taken. You just can't help but show off, can you? Obviously not, Emily quipped, shrugging out of her coat. What good is being a chef if I can't dazzle my best friend? The words should have been harmless, but Cassie felt the familiar pang they brought. Best friend. The title she cherished and resented all at once. She shook the thought away, reminding herself to enjoy the moment. Tonight they were just two friends catching up. Nothing more, nothing less. The first glass of wine loosened the tension Cassie hadn't even realized she was holding. Emily's stories, as always, dominated the conversation, full of wild kitchen mishaps and heartfelt moments. Her laughter was infectious, and Cassie found herself smiling despite the ache that had become a constant companion when Emily was near. For a while she allowed herself to pretend that this was enough, that she didn't need anything beyond this easy camaraderie. But then halfway through dinner everything changed. Emily set her fork down, her expression shifting from playful to something softer, more thoughtful. So, I've been meaning to tell you something, she began, a hint of nervousness in her voice. Cassie's heart skipped a beat. Her mind raced with possibilities, irrational hope flaring for a moment before she forced herself to stay grounded. What is it? She asked, her tone steady, though her hands gripped the edge of the table. Emily hesitated, then smiled. A smile so radiant that it should have been a warning. I'm engaged, she said, her voice light, almost casual, as if she hadn't just dropped a bomb. Cassie froze. The word echoed in her mind, loud and disorienting. Engaged. Engaged, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Her stomach clenched, her chest tightening as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. Yeah, Emily said, oblivious to the devastation her words had caused. She held out her hand, revealing a simple yet elegant diamond ring that sparkled under the warm light. Charlotte proposed last week. I wanted to tell you sooner, but things have been so crazy. Isn't it beautiful? Cassie stared at the ring, her vision blurring at the edges. Charlotte. She had met her once, briefly, at a restaurant opening Emily had invited her to. Charlotte was poised, polished, and successful, the kind of person who seemed to have everything figured out. The kind of person Cassie had always feared would sweep Emily off her feet. It's beautiful, Cassie managed to say, forcing the words out through a throat that felt like it was closing. She pasted on a smile, though her face felt like it might crack under the strain. Congratulations. I'm so happy for you. Emily beamed, her happiness radiating across the table. Thanks, Cass. Still feels surreal, you know? Charlotte's been so supportive of everything. The restaurant, my crazy hours, my dreams. She's everything I've ever wanted. Each word was a dagger, and Cassie felt each one lodge deeper into her heart. She tried to focus on her breathing, on keeping her expression neutral, but inside she was crumbling. Emily's voice continued, but Cassie could barely process the words. Something about wedding plans, venues, the color of the bridesmaids' dresses. It all blurred into background noise. After dinner, Cassie excused herself to the kitchen, needing a moment to collect herself. She gripped the counter, her knuckles white as the tears she had been holding back threatened to spill over. She couldn't do this. She couldn't sit across from Emily, listening to her gush about a future with someone else, knowing that she would never be more than a footnote in Emily's story. But she had to. For Emily's sake. She splashed cold water on her face, took a deep breath, and returned to the living room, her mask firmly in place. Emily was already on the couch, flipping through a magazine Cassie had left out. You've been quiet tonight, Emily remarked as Cassie sat down beside her. Everything okay? Yeah, Cassie lied, her voice steady. Just tired, I guess. Emily reached over, taking Cassie's hand in hers. The gesture was meant to be comforting, but it sent a jolt through Cassie that left her feeling raw and exposed. You mean the world to me, you know that, right? Emily said, her voice soft. You've always been my rock. Cassie's heart twisted at the words. She wanted to scream, to pull her hand away and demand to know why Emily couldn't see how much she was breaking her. But instead she smiled. A small, hollow smile. I know. Emily squeezed her hand before letting go, standing and grabbing her coat. I should get going, she said, her tone cheerful again. Charlotte's waiting for me. But thank you for tonight. It was perfect as always. Cassie stood, following her to the door. Emily pulled her into a hug, warm and lingering, and Cassie clung to it despite herself, even as it felt like a cruel reminder of everything she couldn't have. When the door closed behind Emily, Cassie leaned against it, her body trembling. The tears came then, silent but relentless, as the weight of her heartbreak finally crushed her. She had always known this love was one-sided, but now the reality was unavoidable. Emily belonged to someone else. And no matter how much Cassie wanted to believe otherwise, there was no room for her in the life Emily was building. All that was left was to smile and pretend. The glow of the city seeped through Cassie's bedroom window, casting faint patterns on the ceiling as she lay staring into the dark. The clock beside her bed read 3:30 in the morning, but sleep was a distant dream. Her chest felt heavy, her mind a storm of restless thoughts and unanswered questions. Emily's voice, her laugh, the way her eyes sparkled when she spoke about Charlotte, all of it played on repeat, taunting her. Cassie turned onto her side, clutching the blanket tighter. She didn't need to look at her phone to know that her text thread with Emily sat there, untouched since the night before. She had typed out half a dozen messages, each one deleted before she could send it. There were so many things she wanted to say, things she couldn't possibly put into words without risking everything. But the quiet hours of the night didn't care for reason or restraint. Cassie's mind wandered unbidden to the years they had spent together. The memories felt vivid, almost tangible, as if she could reach out and touch them. It started with a late-night study session in their sophomore year of college, the first time Cassie realized how deeply Emily had rooted herself in her heart. They had been crammed into a tiny dorm room, textbooks and coffee cups scattered across the floor. Emily had been struggling to grasp an art history concept, her frustration bubbling over as she dramatically declared she was dropping the class. You're not dropping anything, Cassie had said, laughing as she nudged Emily's shoulder. You just need to focus. Emily had groaned, collapsing onto the bed beside Cassie. I can't. My brain is fried. I'm hopeless. You're not hopeless, Cassie replied, her voice softening. You're brilliant. You'll figure it out. Emily had turned her head then, her blue eyes locking onto Cassie's. You really think so? The sincerity in her voice, the vulnerability in her gaze. It had made Cassie's chest tighten. She hadn't been able to look away, and for a fleeting moment she thought Emily couldn't either. It was the first time Cassie had felt it. The ache, the pull, the quiet yearning for something more. The memories shifted, pulling Cassie to another moment years later. They had both graduated, navigating the shaky terrain of adulthood. Emily had just gotten her first real job as a sous chef, while Cassie was still piecing together freelance work, unsure of her path. One night, after a particularly brutal rejection from a potential client, Cassie had called Emily in tears. Emily had shown up at her apartment within the hour, a bottle of wine in one hand and a tub of ice cream in the other. She hadn't said much, just sat with Cassie on the couch, listening as she poured out her frustrations. You're going to be okay, Emily had said quietly, her arm wrapped around Cassie's shoulders. You're the strongest person I know. You don't see it, but you are. Cassie had leaned into her then, her head resting against Emily's shoulder. The warmth of Emily's presence, the steady beat of her heart, had been the only thing holding her together that night. She had wanted to say something, to confess the feelings she had buried so deeply, but fear had kept her silent. The memories came faster now, a cascade of moments that felt both beautiful and bittersweet. The way Emily had cheered her on at her first gallery show, even though it was a tiny space with barely a dozen visitors. The time they had gotten caught in a thunderstorm and ended up dancing in the rain, laughing until their sides hurt. The countless hugs, the late-night phone calls, the unspoken understanding that had always existed between them. And yet, for every moment that felt like it could have been something more, doubt crept in. Cassie wondered if she had imagined it all, if she had read too much into a lingering glance, a touch that lasted a second too long. Emily had always been affectionate, open, the kind of person who made everyone feel special. Cassie wasn't the exception. She was just another piece of Emily's orbit. But that kiss, that almost kiss, that fleeting moment in her apartment weeks ago when their faces had been so close, Cassie couldn't dismiss it. The way Emily's eyes had softened, the way the air between them had thickened with tension. It had felt real. It had to have been real. Hadn't it? Cassie sat up in bed, her heart pounding. She ran a hand through her hair, frustration bubbling to the surface. She couldn't keep living like this, trapped between hope and despair. But what choice did she have? Emily was engaged now, her future tied to someone else. Even if there had been a spark between them once, it didn't matter anymore. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, pacing the room. The question she couldn't escape: had Emily ever looked at her the way she looked at Charlotte? Not at her. It felt like a wound that wouldn't heal, a truth she couldn't bring herself to face. If she had been honest years ago, would things be different now? Had her silence cost her the chance at the only love she'd ever truly wanted? The thought was unbearable, and yet it was one she couldn't shake. Cassie found herself at her desk, flipping through old photos. There was one of her and Emily at a college party, their arms slung around each other, grinning like idiots. Another from a road trip, Emily in the driver's seat, sunglasses perched on her nose as she sang along to the radio. Cassie traced the edge of the photo with her finger, her heart aching. I don't know how to do this, she whispered to herself. I don't know how to let you go. The words hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. Outside, the first light of dawn began to creep over the city, but for Cassie, the night felt endless. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, sandwiched between client requests and a reminder about an overdue invoice. Cassie had almost ignored it, but the subject line caught her eye: "Need my maid of honor's expertise." She clicked it with a sinking feeling in her chest, and there it was, a bubbly, effusive message from Emily asking her to help plan the wedding. "You're my best friend," Cass, the email read. "No one knows me like you do. I couldn't do this without you." Cassie's heart clenched. How could she say no? Emily had no idea what she was asking of her. No idea how every mention of the wedding felt like a knife twisting deeper. But refusing would raise questions Emily wasn't ready to hear, and Cassie couldn't bear the thought of losing her. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for what felt like an eternity before she typed her response. "Of course, anything for you." The weeks that followed were nothing short of excruciating. Emily threw herself into wedding planning with her usual enthusiasm, dragging Cassie along to every meeting and errand. They scoured venues, tasted cakes, debated flower arrangements. Emily chattered excitedly about everything, her joy infectious yet agonizing. Every time Cassie saw her eyes light up, she felt both privileged and tormented. She wanted so desperately to make Emily happy, but every choice they made was another reminder that Emily's happiness didn't include her. Then there was Charlotte. Cassie had expected to feel jealousy or resentment toward Emily's fiancé, but what she felt instead was something stranger: disquiet. Charlotte was polished and poised, with an effortless charm that seemed to put everyone at ease. Yet as Cassie spent more time around her, something felt off. Charlotte was always busy, always on her phone or stepping out for calls, even during important planning sessions. She offered compliments easily, but they felt rehearsed, like something she said out of obligation rather than genuine warmth. "Sorry, babe," Charlotte said one evening after arriving late to a tasting. She kissed Emily on the cheek, her smile perfect but her eyes distant. "Work's been crazy." Emily waved it off with a grin, but Cassie noticed the flicker of disappointment in her eyes. "It's fine. Cassie and I handled it." Cassie forced a smile, trying to ignore the pang of protectiveness she felt. She couldn't stand seeing Emily brushed aside, even if it wasn't her place to say anything. One evening, after a particularly long day of running errands, Emily invited Cassie back to her apartment for wine and takeout. The apartment was quiet, and for once Charlotte wasn't there. "She had a work thing," Emily explained, waving it off as she poured 2 glasses of wine. "She's been so busy lately. I swear I don't know how she balances it all." Cassie hesitated. She didn't want to overstep, but she couldn't help herself. "Do you think maybe she's taking on too much?" Emily sighed, sinking onto the couch beside her. "Sometimes. I know she's under a lot of pressure. But it's frustrating, you know? Like, this is supposed to be our time and I feel like I'm doing it all by myself." Cassie's chest tightened. She wanted to tell Emily she deserved better, that she deserved someone who would put her first, but she bit her tongue. "I'm sure she cares. She just has a different way of showing it." Emily looked at her, her expression softening. "You always know what to say." "Seriously, I don't know what I'd do without you." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning Cassie wished she could deny. For a fleeting moment their eyes met, and Cassie thought she saw something in Emily's gaze. Something vulnerable, almost searching. But then Emily broke the moment, laughing lightly as she picked up her wine glass. "Anyway, enough about that. Tell me about your day." Cassie smiled, forcing herself to play along. But as they talked, she couldn't shake the nagging thought that Emily wasn't as happy as she pretended to be. The cracks in Emily and Charlotte's relationship became more apparent with time. Charlotte's absence was a constant shadow over their planning, and when she was present her attitude often bordered on dismissive. She questioned Emily's choices, sometimes subtly, sometimes not, and left Emily second-guessing herself more often than not. One afternoon, while discussing bridesmaid dresses, Charlotte interrupted Emily mid-sentence. "I just think something simpler would be better," she said, her tone polite but firm. "You don't want to overwhelm the aesthetic." Emily's smile faltered, but she nodded. "Yeah, I guess you're right." Cassie bit her lip, barely restraining herself. She wanted to defend Emily, to tell Charlotte that her opinion wasn't the only one that mattered. But she stayed silent, unwilling to cause a scene. Later, as they packed up to leave, Emily turned to Cassie. "Was it too much?" she asked quietly. "The dress I picked?" Cassie shook her head. "It was perfect. You looked stunning." Emily's smile returned, faint but genuine. "Thanks, Cass. I don't know what I'd do without you." As the wedding planning dragged on, Emily's frustrations began to surface more frequently. One night, as they worked on seating arrangements, she suddenly slammed her pen down. "I don't know why I'm doing this," she said, her voice shaky. "Charlotte doesn't even seem to care." Cassie froze, unsure of what to say. Maybe she's just overwhelmed," she offered tentatively. Emily shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "It's more than that. She doesn't listen, Cass. She doesn't get it. I've tried talking to her, but it's like, it doesn't matter. Nothing I say matters." Cassie's heart ached at the sight of Emily so vulnerable, so hurt. She wanted to comfort her, to tell her she deserved better, but the words caught in her throat. Instead she reached out, covering Emily's hand with her own. "You matter," she said softly. "To me." Emily looked at her, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Cassie thought she might say something, but then she pulled her hand away, forcing a smile. "Thanks." I don't know what I'd do without you. Cassie smiled back, but inside she felt like she was breaking. The hope she had tried so hard to suppress was flaring up again, impossible to ignore. Emily wasn't happy. And as much as Cassie hated herself for it, part of her couldn't help but wonder if this was her chance. The storm rolled in quickly, transforming the Chicago sky into a brooding canvas of slate gray. Fat raindrops pelted against the car windows as Cassie parked in front of a small cafe, the neon open sign flickering against the gloom. Emily sat beside her, squinting at her phone as she tried to navigate their growing list of wedding errands. The dashboard light cast a faint glow on her features, accentuating the furrow in her brow. This is insane, Emily muttered, scrolling through her notes. Why does finding the perfect table decorations feel harder than choosing a venue? Cassie smiled faintly, watching as Emily's frustration played out in little gestures. The tap of her finger on the screen, the way her lips pursed. Maybe it's a sign to keep it simple, Cassie offered, hoping to lighten the mood. Mason jars and wildflowers, done. Emily snorted, rolling her eyes. Charlotte would lose her mind. She's all about elegance and aesthetic. Her tone was light, but Cassie caught the edge of tension beneath it. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof with a steady rhythm. Emily glanced out the window and groaned. Looks like we're stuck here for a while. Cassie followed her gaze, the rain cascading down in sheets that obscured the sidewalk. Let's go inside. At least we can wait it out with coffee. Emily didn't argue and they hurried across the street, laughing as they splashed through puddles. By the time they reached the cafe, they were soaked, their hair plastered to their foreheads. Emily shook out her coat, sending droplets everywhere, and Cassie couldn't help but laugh. You're a mess, Cassie teased as they found a corner table. Emily smirked, wringing out her hair. You're no better. The cafe was warm, a sharp contrast to the storm raging outside. The scent of fresh coffee and baked goods filled the air, and a soft jazz tune played over the speakers. Cassie ordered them both drinks, Emily's usual lavender latte and her own black coffee, and brought them back to the table. For a moment, it felt like the world outside didn't exist. As they sipped their drinks, the conversation drifted to lighter topics. Memories of college, the ridiculous wedding trends they'd seen online, Emily's latest kitchen adventures. But gradually the mood shifted. Emily grew quieter, her gaze flickering to the rain-streaked window as if lost in thought. Cassie leaned forward, her voice soft. You okay? Emily hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. I don't know, she admitted, her voice barely audible over the hum of the cafe. Sometimes I feel like I'm spinning plates, trying to keep everything balanced, but at any moment, it's all going to come crashing down. Cassie's chest tightened. Is it the wedding? Or Charlotte? Emily let out a humorless laugh. Both. Neither. I don't know. I mean, I love her, of course I do. But sometimes it feels like we're not on the same page. Like I'm trying so hard to make this work, but it's never enough. The vulnerability in Emily's voice cut through Cassie like a blade. She wanted to reach across the table, to take Emily's hand and tell her that she deserved better. But she stayed frozen, her heart pounding as Emily continued. I thought getting engaged would feel different, Emily said, her voice cracking slightly. Like everything would fall into place, you know? But instead I feel more unsure than ever. Cassie swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she spoke. Maybe that's because it's not what you really want. The words hung in the air, heavy and daring. Emily looked up sharply, her blue eyes locking onto Cassie's. For a moment the world seemed to stop. The rain outside, the chatter of the other patrons, even the music. It all faded away, leaving only the two of them in that charged silence. Cassie, Emily began, her voice a whisper. Cassie's heart raced. She didn't know what she was doing, only that she couldn't stop herself. You don't have to do this, not if it doesn't feel right. Emily's gaze softened, her eyes searching Cassie's face as if looking for an answer to a question she couldn't ask. The distance between them felt impossibly small, the air crackling with unspoken words. Cassie could feel the pull, the gravity of everything they had never said drawing them closer. And then, just as Emily's lips parted as if to speak, the moment shattered. Her phone buzzed loudly on the table, the name Charlotte flashing on the screen. Emily flinched, the spell breaking as she grabbed the phone. I have to take this, she said quickly, her voice shaky. Cassie nodded, forcing herself to look away as Emily answered the call. Hey babe, Emily said, her tone bright and composed as if the last few minutes hadn't happened. She turned away slightly, her voice dropping as she spoke into the phone. Cassie stared down at her coffee, her hands trembling. The storm outside mirrored the one inside her. The hope that had flickered so briefly now snuffed out. She had felt it, she knew she had felt it, but it didn't matter. Charlotte's name, her voice, was a wall Cassie couldn't climb. When Emily hung up, she avoided Cassie's eyes, her smile strained. Charlotte's just checking in. She's been worried about the weather. Cassie nodded, unable to find her voice. The warmth of the cafe now felt suffocating and she fought to keep her emotions in check. We should probably head out soon, she said finally, her tone carefully neutral. Emily hesitated as if she wanted to say something, but instead she simply nodded. Yeah. You're right. As they stepped back into the rain, Cassie felt the weight of the moment settle over her like a lead blanket. The tension between them remained, unspoken but undeniable. Emily walked ahead, her figure silhouetted against the storm, and for the first time, Cassie allowed herself to wonder if she had already lost her. The days following the storm were quiet, yet heavy with unspoken tension. Emily had pulled back, her text shorter and less frequent, her usual warmth replaced by a distant, almost cautious tone. Cassie tried not to let it hurt, but the space between them felt like a chasm. Each hour that passed brought new doubts, new fears that she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She replayed their moment in the cafe, dissecting every glance, every word, every pause. What had Emily been about to say before Charlotte's call shattered the moment? Did it even matter now? Cassie found herself withdrawing too, unsure how to navigate the fractured pieces of their friendship. She threw herself into work, into long nights sketching designs she wasn't happy with, hoping the distraction would quiet the ache in her chest. It didn't. It was late on a Friday night when the knock came. Cassie was sprawled on her couch, half-heartedly watching a movie, her attention drifting to the soft patter of rain against the windows. She frowned, glancing at the clock, almost midnight. She wasn't expecting anyone. She opened the door to find Emily standing there, drenched from the rain, her eyes red and swollen. Her usually confident posture was gone, replaced by a defeated slump. Cassie's heart leapt into her throat. Emily, she said, stepping aside instinctively. What's wrong? Emily didn't answer right away. She stepped inside, her arms wrapped around herself, shivering slightly. Cassie closed the door and turned to face her, the silence stretching unbearably. She ended it, Emily said finally, her voice cracking. Charlotte canceled the wedding. The words hung in the air and for a moment, Cassie couldn't breathe. She studied Emily's face, searching for some sign that this was a misunderstanding, a cruel joke. But the raw pain in Emily's eyes was unmistakable. Cassie hesitated, her own emotions swirling in a chaotic mess of relief, guilt, and anger on Emily's behalf. What happened? She asked carefully. Emily sank onto the couch, running a hand through her wet hair. She said, her voice broke and she took a shaky breath. She said, I deserve someone who can be what I need. Someone who can value me. Her laugh was bitter, hollow. She didn't even say it like an apology. It was like she was doing me a favor. Cassie sat beside her, unsure of what to say. She reached out tentatively, placing a hand on Emily's arm. I'm so sorry, Em. Emily shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. I don't know why I didn't see it sooner. We've been growing apart for months. I kept convincing myself that things would get better, that this was just stress or bad timing. But deep down I knew. I knew she wasn't what I needed. The words struck a chord deep within Cassie and she felt her heart race. You deserved better, she said softly, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. You deserve someone who sees you, who really sees you. Emily looked at her then, her eyes searching Cassie's face as if trying to decode the layers beneath her words. You've always been there for me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Every time I needed someone, you were there. I don't know how to thank you for that. Cassie felt her chest tighten. She wanted to tell Emily the truth, to finally lay everything bare. But she was afraid of pushing Emily away, afraid of saying too much. You don't have to thank me, she said instead. I'm your friend. That's what friends do. Emily's gaze didn't waver and for a long moment, the silence between them was heavy with things unsaid. It's more than that, Emily said finally, her voice trembling. It's always been more than that with you. Cassie's breath caught, her heart hammering in her chest. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Emily shifted closer, her hand brushing against Cassie's. The contact was light, tentative, but it sent a jolt through Cassie. "I've been scared," Emily admitted, her voice raw. "Scared to mess this up, to lose you. But tonight, when I was sitting alone in that apartment, all I could think about was you. I just kept wishing I could talk to you, be with you." Cassie's heart ached at the vulnerability in Emily's words, the raw honesty she had waited so long to hear. "You don't have to be scared," Cassie said softly, her voice steady now. "I'm here. I've always been here." Emily's eyes filled with fresh tears, but this time they weren't tears of sorrow. She leaned forward, her forehead resting against Cassie's, their breaths mingling in the small space between them. Cassie felt the weight of years of longing, of unspoken feelings, all culminating in this fragile, perfect moment. And then Emily closed the distance, her lips brushing against Cassie's in a kiss that was hesitant at first, but quickly deepened as the barriers between them crumbled. The kiss was everything Cassie had dreamed of and more. Desperate, tender, a confession of all the things they had been too afraid to say. When they finally pulled apart, Emily cupped Cassie's face in her hands, her eyes searching hers. "I don't know what this means," Emily said, her voice trembling. "But I know I don't want to lose you. Not now. Not ever." Cassie smiled, her own tears spilling over. "Then don't," she said simply. "We'll figure it out together." The night stretched on and the storm outside began to fade. Inside, Cassie and Emily talked, their words weaving a new story. One of hope, of second chances, of love that had always been there waiting to be discovered. And for the first time in a long time, Cassie felt at peace, her heart finally where it belonged. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the heater in the corner, its steady rhythm filling the gaps where words might have been. Cassie sat beside Emily on the couch, their knees almost touching, the proximity both comforting and unbearable. Emily's face was a mixture of heartbreak and exhaustion, her usually vibrant energy replaced by a heaviness that Cassie felt like a tangible weight in the room. Cassie had never seen her like this, so unguarded, so raw. Emily's red-rimmed eyes glistened in the low light, her fingers clutching a tissue she twisted absently. She had been crying off and on since she arrived, the storm of emotions overwhelming her. "I should have seen it coming," Emily said suddenly, her voice hoarse but steady. "She's been pulling away for months. I didn't want to believe it." Cassie didn't trust herself to speak. Her heart ached for Emily, but underneath that was something more complex. Relief. Relief that Charlotte was gone, that the wedding was off, that maybe now there was a chance. But with that relief came fear. Fear of what it might mean to hope. "She said I deserved someone who understood me," Emily continued, her voice breaking on the last words. "Someone who could give me the time and attention I need. But if she thought that, why did she even propose in the first place?" Cassie reached out instinctively, her hand covering Emily's where it rested on her lap. "You do deserve that, Emily," she said softly. "You deserve someone who sees you for who you are, who knows exactly how amazing you are." Emily's gaze shifted to their hands, her lips trembling. "Do I?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "Because right now I feel like I wasn't enough." Cassie's heart broke at the vulnerability in her voice. She tightened her grip on Emily's hand, her thumb brushing against her knuckles. "You are more than enough. Charlotte didn't see it because she wasn't the right person for you. That's not your fault." Emily looked up then, her eyes meeting Cassie's. The air between them shifted, thick with an emotion Cassie couldn't quite name. Emily's tears slowed, her breathing steadying as she searched Cassie's face. "You've always been there for me," Emily said after a long pause, her voice trembling but steady. "You always understand me better than anyone. Even when I don't know what I need, you do." The words struck Cassie like a lightning bolt. She felt her chest tighten, her breath catch. This was her moment. A fragile, fleeting moment where everything hung in the balance. Her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, but her heart knew only one truth. Cassie leaned forward, her movements slow, almost hesitant. Her free hand reached up to gently cup Emily's cheek, her thumb brushing away a stray tear. Emily's breath hitched, her eyes widening slightly but not pulling away. Cassie could feel the heat of her skin, the faint tremor under her touch, and for a moment she wondered if she was making a mistake. But then Emily leaned into her touch, her eyes closing briefly before opening again, searching Cassie's with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. The silence between them was deafening, charged with years of unspoken feelings, with everything Cassie had buried and everything Emily hadn't yet realized. Before she could second-guess herself, Cassie closed the distance. Her lips pressed against Emily's in a kiss that was tentative at first, as if testing the fragile line between them. But the hesitation melted away almost instantly, replaced by a surge of emotion that left them both breathless. Emily responded, her hand coming up to grip Cassie's arm, pulling her closer. The kiss deepened, filled with all the passion and longing Cassie had kept bottled up for so long. It wasn't perfect, there was a desperation to it, an urgency that made it almost clumsy, but it was real. It was raw. It was everything Cassie had dreamed of and more. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard, their foreheads resting against each other. Emily's eyes were wide, her cheeks flushed, her lips slightly swollen. Cassie searched her face, looking for any sign of regret, of doubt, but all she saw was wonder. "Cassie," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Cassie placed a finger gently over Emily's lips, silencing her. "You don't have to say anything," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Just tell me this wasn't a mistake." Emily shook her head slowly, her eyes filling with fresh tears. "It wasn't," she said, her voice breaking. "It wasn't a mistake." Cassie felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was tempered by the uncertainty still lingering between them. She pulled back slightly, giving Emily space, but her hand remained on her cheek, grounding them both. "I don't know what this means," Emily admitted, her voice trembling. I'm still trying to figure everything out." "I know," Cassie said, her tone gentle. "And I'm not going anywhere. Whatever this is, whatever you need, I'll be here." Emily let out a shaky breath, her lips curving into a small, tentative smile. "You always are, aren't you?" Cassie returned the smile, her own emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Always." For the first time in what felt like forever, the tension between them eased. They sat together in the quiet, the rain outside a soft backdrop to the moment they had finally allowed themselves to share. Cassie knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time she felt a glimmer of hope, a chance to turn their shared pain into something beautiful. And for now that was enough. The days that followed the kiss were a blur of emotions for Cassie. She replayed the moment endlessly, trying to hold on to the memory of Emily's lips on hers, the vulnerability in her voice when she said it wasn't a mistake. But with the elation came a crushing uncertainty. Emily hadn't stayed that night. After the kiss, she had pulled Cassie into a long, trembling embrace, whispering something about needing time to process everything. Cassie had let her go, watching as Emily disappeared into the rain, the ghost of her touch lingering long after she was gone. Now Cassie found herself in a strange limbo. Emily was still present in her life, texting her good morning, checking in, sharing bits of her day, but the dynamic between them had shifted. Their conversations were laced with an unspoken tension, moments of silence where Cassie could feel the weight of the kiss hanging between them. She didn't push, afraid of overwhelming Emily, but the waiting was agony. It was 3 days after the kiss when Emily finally called, her name lighting up Cassie's phone late in the evening. Cassie's stomach flipped as she answered, trying to keep her voice steady. "Hey," she said softly. "Hey," Emily replied, her tone uncertain. "Can I come over?" "Of course." Cassie's heart raced as she hung up, pacing the living room as she waited. When Emily arrived, she looked exhausted but determined, her eyes filled with something Cassie couldn't quite place. Emily stepped inside without a word, her presence filling the room as it always did. She sat on the couch, her hands fidgeting in her lap. Cassie joined her, sitting close enough to feel the heat of her body but leaving enough space for Emily to speak first. "I've been thinking," Emily began, her voice quiet but steady. "About everything. About us." Cassie held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "And?" Emily glanced at her, her eyes softening. "I don't regret the kiss," she said, her voice trembling. "But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't scared. Everything's so complicated right now. I'm still trying to make sense of the breakup, of what went wrong with Charlotte. And then there's us. This connection I've always felt but never really understood." Cassie reached out, her fingers brushing against Emily's hand. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," she said gently. "We don't have to figure it all out at once." Emily smiled faintly, her fingers lacing through Cassie's. "You've always been so patient with me. It's because you're worth it," Cassie replied, her voice barely above a whisper. In the days that followed, they began to navigate the uncertain terrain of their new relationship. It was a delicate dance, full of stops and starts, moments of vulnerability and moments of hesitation. Emily was still processing the end of her engagement, and Cassie gave her space to grieve, even when it hurt to see her struggle. One evening, as they sat on Cassie's couch sharing a bottle of wine, Emily turned to her with a small, bittersweet smile. "Do you ever think about how long we've known each other?" she asked. "Of course," Cassie said. "How could I forget?" Emily's smile grew wistful. "I keep replaying all these little moments in my head. Times when you were there for me, when you understood me better than anyone else. And I wonder, was it always this? Was it always you?" Cassie felt her throat tighten, her heart swelling at the words. "I think so," she admitted. "At least for me." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "I feel like I'm seeing everything differently now. Like I've been blind to something that was right in front of me." Cassie reached out, her hand cupping Emily's cheek. "You weren't ready before. And that's okay. What matters is that we're here now." Emily leaned into her touch, her eyes closing briefly before opening again. "I don't want to lose this, Cassie. I don't want to lose you." "You won't," Cassie promised. "We'll figure it out one step at a time." But the journey wasn't easy. Emily had moments of doubt, flashes of guilt over how quickly things had shifted after her breakup. "What if I'm rushing into this?" she confessed one night, her voice trembling. "What if I mess this up?" "You're allowed to feel that way," Cassie said, her voice steady. "This is new and it's scary. But you don't have to do it alone." They had difficult conversations too, about the boundaries they needed to navigate, about the risks of turning a friendship into something more. Cassie opened up about the years she had spent hiding her feelings, the quiet ache she had carried all this time. Emily listened, her eyes filled with a mixture of regret and wonder. "I wish I'd seen it sooner," Emily said softly. "I feel like I've wasted so much time." "You didn't waste anything," Cassie replied. "We're here now. That's all that matters." Their first official date was a quiet dinner at Cassie's apartment, a far cry from the bustling restaurants Emily was used to. Cassie cooked, laughing at Emily's attempts to help, and they ate by candlelight, the atmosphere intimate but relaxed. Emily reached across the table at one point, her fingers brushing against Cassie's. "This feels right," Emily said, her voice soft. "Like it's where I'm supposed to be." "It is," Cassie replied, her heart swelling. That night, as they lay tangled together on the couch, Emily rested her head on Cassie's shoulder, her fingers tracing absent patterns on Cassie's arm. "I'm scared," she admitted. "But I'm also happy. For the first time in a long time I feel like I can breathe." Cassie kissed the top of her head, holding her close. "We'll take it one day at a time," she said. "No pressure, no expectations. Just us." Emily looked up at her, her eyes shining with tears but her smile radiant. "Just us," she echoed. As the weeks turned into months, they found their rhythm. There were still challenges, moments of doubt, old wounds that needed time to heal, but they faced them together, leaning on the foundation of trust and love they had built over the years. Their journey wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and for the first time, both of them felt like they were exactly where they belonged.